Good morning to everyone who's just joining us. We'll be starting in just a minute or two. We're just going to give a few moments for people to join. Once again, good morning to everyone who's just joining us. We're just giving everyone one more minute to join, and then we will get going. Thank you. Okay, thank you for your patience, everyone. So we are going to kick this thing off. So welcome everyone to the HAPI 5.5.0 release, as well as the SMILE CDR 2021.08.R01 release webinar. This release, we have given the code name of QUASAR. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So welcome to everyone who's joining us. To anyone who hasn't attended one of these webinars before, we do these, of course, following a regular release cadence for the two products we're just discussing today. Our release cadence has us do a new release once a quarter, so we do them every 3 months. We are, of course, in the middle of August right now, and the next release will be in November, followed by February, and so on and so forth. We have gotten pretty good at sticking to that schedule the last while, so I think it's a good chance we'll be sticking to it from now on, which is awesome. It's taken us a while to get there. So, of course, as always, we're going to talk a little bit about what's new. We're going to mostly focus on what's new this time around. We're going to talk a little bit about what's coming up. And we've got some time reserved at the end for a Q&A portion if anyone has any questions they would like to raise about what we're up to, what we've done, any of that good stuff. So let's start by talking a little bit about the product name, the release name, QUASAR. I often when we have a weird word, we explain what it is. I think if I remember right, a few releases ago, we had Odyssey, and I made a joke that we'd named it after the popular minivan. And someone pointed out to me that QUASAR, I could just talk about stars, but I could also just say that we're naming all our releases after cars these days. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this. This is the Peugeot QUASAR. So I'm going to pretend that that's what we named this thing after. Man, that thing is just the weirdest looking car I've ever seen. I'm not really a car guy, but you got to appreciate how bizarre that thing looks. I just love it. It's like a symbol of all things 80s. Truthfully, that's not what we named the release after, but it is kind of fun to look at that thing. So don't normally do this, but I figure why not? I'm going to talk a little bit about just the pulse of the project and what we're up to these days before getting into what's new, because we have been really, really busy. Like, busier than I think we ever have been over the last while, with a number of things that I'm going to quickly talk about before getting into our usual feature roundup. For those who are located really anywhere other than the US, you may not be aware of a thing called the final rule in the US, which sort of mandated that a bunch of organizations had to stand up consumer-facing APIs based on FHIR that would sort of serve up basically patients their own data through these internet accessible APIs. It is truly, truly an astonishingly cool thing that's going on in the US right now. I think it's just amazing, and we'll probably have awesome reverberations around the world as other governments try to do the same thing. I would be lying if I said that the work on that hasn't dominated us the last quarter. That's not to say we haven't worked on other things. We absolutely have, but it has been a big topic of a big focus of effort, a big topic of discussion, and I'm proud to say that we have as an organization got over 20 payers live with their final rule APIs, and that is just an astonishing bit of work by the team who've worked on that. So great job to everyone. As you may or may not have heard, we had a press release, not a software release, not too long ago. And if you haven't, you could certainly find this by Google. I probably should have included a link, but I didn't. Smile CDR, the company, which is of course the company behind HAPI and of course our eponymous product, had our first fundraising round. We've had what they call a Series A fundraising round. That we announced, I think, just over 2 weeks ago, or a little under 2 weeks ago, actually, which is really exciting times for us. I mean, we've been in business now for 5-ish years, and of course, the HAPI project was around for another 5 before that. And I mean, both of these products have grown organically since the start of their lifetime, and have always, it's been always a struggle to sort of, do this on the back, basically reinvesting any little bit of profit we can ever make into continuing to solidify the team. And I think the funding that we've got is sort of a testament to a bit of stability. So I think ultimately this is great news for anyone who's using either of these products, because it does sort of help cement us as a stable and long-term company that will continue to hopefully keep doing the good stuff that we've been doing. We're all really excited about that. An interesting milestone for HAPI that I just noticed the other day. We're now averaging 14 what I'll call core committers, and core committers are sort of internal people on our side who are contributing code to the code base, which I think is really cool. So if you're wondering what's the size of the internal team, it's 14 core committers. I often give slides, and I actually didn't do it this time. Maybe we'll go back to that next time and do a comparison, but this really this doesn't nearly tell the entire picture, because of course, every single release, we have just an amazing number of community contributions that come in, and the community of people who have contributed code to HAPI is at this point well over 200 people. So it really is a pretty impressive thing. But if you're wondering how many people are sort of getting paid constantly to work on the product these days, there are 14 people that actively have done so in the last month, that's pretty neat, actually. I think also speaks to the stability of the product that hopefully many of you guys are using. And then finally, on a personal note, I will say I managed over the last 3 weeks up until a week ago to spend, for the first time since 2017, 2 weeks without looking at a laptop, which, man, that felt just crazy. That's pretty cool stuff. I came back and then realized in a panic we had a release a week later. So if I seem a little bit disorganized today, that's all that is. I'm still in vacation hangover, shall we say, but that's all good. Also worth mentioning, I think you may even be watching us on his vacation. Duncan, our CEO, is on vacation out in the West Coast as we speak. So Duncan, if you're out there, I hope you're having a great time. Let's get on to what we're up to. Let's get on to what's new. This is the usual stuff. So a couple of key takeaways before we get into individual features. For HAPI, I think the biggest takeaway, and this does not nearly tell the whole story because there's lots of other new stuff in the product that we're going to talk about, but performance has been one of our dominant concerns over the last quarter. A lot of that comes down to our work with these final rule APIs. That's not, of course, the only driver, but the fact that we've now got so many people with such massive databases using sort of HAPI-FHIR JPA and SMILE CDR repository has led us to have to put quite a bit of effort into performance work, and we've done a staggering amount of work on that. One of the things I was really hoping to do for this release was to come up with some numbers to quantify what I'm saying here. I didn't unfortunately have time because of the vacation I was talking about, but one of the things I will promise for our next release webinar is I'm going to take you through comparative performance numbers for our last 2 years worth of releases, because I think it's going to be really cool to look at once we do that. So all the more reason to come back in November and get a sense of how that all goes. On the SMILE CDR side, our key areas, and again, not everything we've done, but our key areas, certainly performance for very much the same reasons as HAPI-FHIR. And of course, all of the HAPI-FHIR performance improvements end up in SMILE anyway. We've also done a ton of work over the last quarter in data integration. And what I mean by that is sort of mechanisms for getting data into SMILE, and in some cases, other ways than FHIR interfaces for getting it out of SMILE as well. This includes our capabilities for CDA, our ability to use things like Kafka topics to stream data into databases, that type of thing. We've put just so much work into that, as well as what I'm calling ecosystem tools, which is going to be just an ever-growing part of our future. So this is things like the app gallery that I was talking about last time, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But there's a bunch of other work that's going on there, has been going on. And if I can read the tea leaves a little bit, I suspect that's only going to get bigger, as we've got a bunch of ideas for some pretty cool ecosystem tools that are going to sort of help to flesh out what the SMILE CDR ecosystem ultimately looks like. One other thing I'll say in terms of timing, this really speaks to our organization. I should probably give a quick shout out to Gary Graham, one of our awesome rockstar developers, he's really taken the reins on getting this release actually out the door and built. We ran into a couple of last minute sort of things we've realized we should really resolve before actually finalizing. So while we're doing the release webinar today, the binaries are not expected to be available for a couple of days farther. We just decided it was better to make sure it was perfect than to rush it out the door. So sorry for that, but it's worth the wait. I don't even want to exactly promise timing on it, but I would say probably tomorrow, and if not that, for sure Monday. I'm sure we'll have a release in your hands that you can start playing with. So there we go. So getting into features, first off, on HAPI-FHIR, we've introduced a new validation support module that this is a bit of a mouthful, but we'll call it the programmatic NPM validation module. As anyone who's been doing any validation using the awesome IG NPM spec, which allows you to package up validation artifacts and download them from central registries and stuff like that, it's been possible for a while now to upload those into your repository and then apply them to validation. What it was not possible for you to do is if you were doing validation purely through Java code and didn't have a repository running, there was no way of taking advantage of NPM modules. That has now changed. We do have a validation module that allows you to do exactly that. Load an NPM module from disk or ClassPath or whatever and serve it directly into the validator with no repository needed. There's lots of documentation on the website in terms of how that works. So pretty cool feature, actually. We've seen a few people already start playing with that with pretty good results, actually. Another interesting little change that's gone into both products is what we're calling offset mode. So in the JPA repository and in the SMILE CDR repository, as many people know, we've got this module called the query cache, which stores previously searched queries for faster paging and consistent paging and all of that good stuff. A contribution that came in from the community into HAPI-FHIR a while ago allowed for us to turn the query cache off and instead just use offset counts. So say I want the first 10 results and then the next 10 and then the next 10, instead of using these opaque paging links. And one of the nice things about that is it allows for truly stateless paging, which is great if you're sort of building a great big architecture where some of your nodes support the data writing and others are read-only. That's a pretty popular way of handling replication for great big databases. It was a bit of a pain in the butt to get working before, and with offset mode now being a top order component of the product, if that's your architecture, we support it with very little fuss, which is really nice. So you can turn that on pretty easily. Lots of stuff has happened on the terminology front, as we do every release. I almost feel like a broken record saying this stuff, but it is obviously very important, and never continues to grow. We've now got native support for the format that ICD-10-CM is distributed in. So if you need to use ICD-10-CM, we can import it using the exact formats that they are distributed in. We've also made a number of enhancements to LOINC. We've got an ongoing project that we'll be adding a bunch more to the next release as well. But what's in now is support, of course, for the now current version of LOINC, which is 2.70. As well as support for two other data files that are a part of LOINC that we didn't previously support importing. One is the consumer name, which provides alternate names for a bunch of the content in LOINC. That's sort of consumer focused, so very cool if you're building consumer facing apps. I think you can see why that's important. As well as the support for what LOINC, I've always thought this name was neat, their linguistic variant file, which is a fancy way, I think I'm probably oversimplifying it, sorry if I am, but fancy way of saying the translations, the language translations for the content in LOINC. This, of course, to us in Canada is quite important because the Canadians here in Canada, of course, we have two official languages, and there is absolutely a French version of LOINC's content with a hilarious acronym of PCLOD. That content is distributed in the linguistic variant file, so certainly the use cases for this are not only purely Canadian, but any fellow Canadians, we can now get PCLOD imported natively into a repository, which is useful for all kinds of good reasons. Another interesting change on the performance front is a mode that we'll call inline tag mode. This one is tough to explain, but I wanted to get it in here just because it's particularly useful to some people who are trying to do extremely high volume databases. One of the features, of course, of tags in FHIR, and by tags, I'm talking about the whole suite of related bits, tags, security labels, and profile declarations. According to the FHIR spec, they all follow this funny pattern where they're actually versioned independently from the rest of the resource. And there's all kinds of interesting implications that come from that. We do support that fully, we always have, but all of our implementation always was sort of built on this assumption that in any given server, you'd have a relatively low number of unique tags. As in, you'd know what your tags were in advance, and occasionally you'd add new ones, but you wouldn't have, thousands being added every minute or anything like that of unique tags, as in tags with a different code or system across time. But we've seen a few examples of people wanting to use tags to store very unique information, where each resource has its own unique tag. That particular scenario did not scale well with the previous implementation. So if you have got a database that follows the pattern I just described, you are going to see a dramatic improvement in performance if you enable inline tag mode. I'm not going to say any more about it because it is a pretty esoteric thing to anyone who doesn't need it, but it will really help your performance if you are in the scenario I just described. As always, so we introduced partitioning, I guess about a year ago, I want to say, something around a year ago. That feature, it just blows me away how popular it's been. I was expecting it at the time to be a fairly niche feature, but we have just been absolutely blown away, both by HAPI FHIR as well as Smile CDR users. All of the fascinating use cases people have come up with it, because of course it's not just for multi-tenancy. That was one of the use cases, but not nearly the only one. People have come up with all kinds of fascinating uses for partitioning. And as soon as they do that, they start asking, why can't I do X with partitioning? Because of course, not every single part of the repository is partition aware. So we are continuing to close that gap and will continue to close that gap. But a few things that have been added over the last quarter include support for CQL on a partitioned server, which I mean, to me, CQL is one of the most fascinating parts of the entire, broader FHIR ecosystem, if we could put it that way. I am a huge fan of CQL, and seeing it come alive on partitioned servers, I mean, how cool is that? Well, at least to me, it's super cool. We've also enabled support for partitioning for the Smile CDR channel import module, as well as the Smile CDR ETL import module. So if you're trying to rapidly ingest a ton of data into a partitioned server, you've now got a few more ways you can do that, which is good. A quick note on JDK versioning. I talked about this last quarter as well, and we completed what we said we would, which is to say HAPI is now fully built using JDK 16. You're still able to use it absolutely on any JDK all the way from 8 to 16. So we've got a pretty wide range of support now, which is great. Smile CDR previously was certified to run on JDKs 8 and 11. We're now certified to run on 16 as well. You may, if you're a JDK nerd, be wondering why 16, just because 8 and 11 are so-called LTS releases, which people popularly support. The next of those is 17. The only reason we're not supporting 17 is because it's not yet released, actually. So as soon as JDK 17 comes out, we will absolutely add that to the list as well. I will say we are contemplating a move probably at the end of the year from JDK 8 to 11 as our minimum supported version. That is a disruptive change, we realize, for some people, and it's not set in stone, but it is, I don't know, it's a tough balance to forge, just because at this point, JDK 8 is end of life and will stop receiving security alerts, security updates. And I think given that we're dealing with health data, it's hard in good conscience to continue to support a version of Java that no longer receives security updates. So we may well up our minimum version at some point soon. If anyone has an opinion on that, we would of course love to hear about it. I'm going to make a post shortly on the HAPI mailing list looking for community input into that decision as well. So there we go. A few slides on our batch framework. I have talked about this a bunch in the last few releases. We, of course, implemented a batch framework that can be used to make batch processes more seamless. And of course, as the use of CDRs grows, as people are doing more fascinating things with repositories, the need for you to operate over large pools of data becomes more and more important, because what you can do at small scale doesn't necessarily translate to large scale unless you introduce machinery to allow that to happen. So we introduced a batch framework a while ago, converted a few of our initial long-running jobs to use it, and have continued to do that over time. One of those jobs is our resource re-indexing, which allows you to go back and retroactively apply new search parameters or repopulate your data into Elasticsearch. There's a few reasons you might re-index data. We have now deprecated the previous mechanism for re-indexing, which is the really wordy mark all resources for re-indexing operation. I can take credit for that terrible name myself. That is now deprecated. It does still work, but it has been replaced in our hearts by a much better named, and we can thank Ken for the better name, re-index operation. And the re-index operation takes advantage of the batch framework. So it's a much better way of doing this, actually. So that's pretty cool. Bulk import is a perennial topic. We hear about this all the time. People are asking us more or less constantly, do you support bulk import yet? And I've been saying it's coming, it's coming. I can now share some visible progress on bulk import. It is partly done. Long story short, we don't yet support the $import operation, I'm sad to say, but we're close. And the reason I can say we're close is we have done everything except for the external API service at this point. So we have implemented a bulk import batch job using the batch framework. It's really cool. It ingests data at a really fast rate. There's lots of stuff left to do with it, I think, to make it even more performant, but it's a great start, and I think is usable even as it is. And I would say it's done, except that there's no way of calling it yet from the outside world. So we need to implement the last bit of API surface that you can actually invoke $import, but that's pretty easy compared to actually creating the batch job. So I think we're pretty close. Worth mentioning, if you're a Smile CDR user and you're using our ETL module, in asynchronous mode specifically, that module does use this machinery. So it has gotten some good real world testing. It just doesn't have $import support quite yet. So soon to come. Another interesting one, and I always find it fascinating. We implemented the ability to expunge data long ago. HAPI has had that support for ages now. And to me, expunge was always just a tool you'd use if you'd incorrectly added one record or like one person's data or something like that and needed to physically wipe it from your database. But of course, that was my original view of how that was useful. And it turns out I was thinking way too narrow, I suppose. Lots of people have come up with much broader use cases for expunge. And we have for a while now supported what we call delete and expunge, which is a mechanism for doing both a FHIR delete and an expunge over one or more resources, potentially quite a few resources, as a single operation that does both of those things. That operation has been converted to be batch aware as well. So now if you've got massive amounts of data to delete and expunge, you can do that as a batch job, which really makes that a whole lot more scalable. Pretty cool stuff. And then finally, on the batch front, if you are a Smile CDR user, we've now got a little console in the web admin console. So there's a page in there that actually lets you see progress on batch jobs. And as we add more and more of them, I think this will become quite useful to anyone that wants to see how their batch jobs are doing, including the delete expunge that I just spoke about. Next up, I'll talk very quickly about our progress on our MDM module. If you're not familiar with MDM, this is the module that does EMPI plus a whole bunch more. MDM is something that we see as really a foundational technology to both HAPI FHIR and to Smile CDR. We're starting to see some great real world adoption of that technology, and I think we're just scratching the surface of how useful this is going to be. It is worth mentioning, we've got operations in now that can be used for querying links as well as golden records. Of course, once you start trying to use those in any kind of real world application, before you realize they didn't do paging, so they just give you a giant dump in some cases of everything they found. They're now paging aware, which is quite nice if you're trying to build data in there. I intended to have another slide, and I see that I forgot to put that one in. So I will say that's not the only change in MDM. There's a bunch of other great stuff in there. I guess I'll be secretive and say, go check out the change logs, which are, truthfully, the change logs are already up, even if the binaries aren't. So we can go today and find out what it is that I'm hiding from you in this webinar. Let's move on to CDA. So I was talking at the start about work on data interoperability, and one big part of that is interoperating with one of our favorite old, well, I don't know, legacy standards. I think it's fair to call it that, the clinical document architecture. We have spent a ton of time working on a big enhancement to our CDA module over the last quarter. This allows you to do, among other things, we've added a bunch of support for new data elements that will go into the into your generated FHIR documents and CDA documents, as well as support for a FHIR operation called the docref endpoint, which these days can be a part of a recipe for pulling out existing documents that exist. It was pointed out to me, we've got a bunch more work to do on that before we can say it's an absolutely complete version of that. But that entire way of thinking is no surprise to any longtime listeners, because that tends to be the way we work around here. We do try and get things in people's hands as quickly as possible, and we are going to continue to iterate on things like the docref endpoint over time. Next two slides, I can't take credit for them. I think these are probably the most pretty things in the entire presentation, which clearly wasn't my work because I'm terrible at that kind of thing. Just to say that our existing support for exporting CCDs and CDAs and that type of thing allowed for a fairly minimal set of CCD sections to be exported. We have added a number of other ones. So these days, if you are trying to create comprehensive CCDs with lots and lots of data, our templating system has become way more powerful. Tons of good features in there, more than I could possibly get on a slide and do justice to. But again, all of that lives in the change logs. So there's some really good stuff there. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about app management tools. App management tools includes our app gallery, as well as tools for managing apps for deployment. And if you are in the position of having a FHIR repository that you want to support apps against, whether those apps are for consumers and the general public, or they're for your internal enterprise users, and you want to create sort of an ecosystem of apps that are available to take advantage of the rich set of FHIR data that you undoubtedly have locked up in your systems today. Naturally, tools like our app gallery and the rest of the app management ecosystem are a great part of that. We've done a ton of work there. We've now got this awesome sandbox that's been developed to allow people to test against your system. We've got editors for working with the attestation portions that allow your third party, like the independent developers of the apps, to submit attestations about what their apps will do with your data and that type of thing. We've put a bunch of work into customizability for how you how your users ultimately perceive what they're authorizing. That, if you're wondering what we mean by that, of course, all of this technology is built on Smart on FHIR, which is of course built on OAuth 2. OAuth can be a really simple process where you just sort of approve and then you get your app, but really for it to shine, you take advantage of the scopes and the rich power that comes with Smart on FHIR to ultimately allow users to have fine-grained control over what data they're releasing to the app, and ultimately an understanding of what they're doing and what the app is ultimately going to do with that data. Super important stuff. I think as we see consumer-facing FHIR apps take hold around the world, naturally, the entire ecosystem that I think we all want to see spring into existence really can only work if the end users, the non-technical folks, have an understanding of what's going on with their data and taking advantage of all the power that comes with Smart on FHIR. Naturally, big part of that, and ultimately that wordy explanation was why I think that bullet is so important, as well as some onboarding enhancements, including the ability for us to now communicate via email automatically with developers to sort of complete their approval process to get their apps into galleries. So that entire process has gotten a whole lot better. There we go. One other thing I'll say before we get to our Q&A, and we're right on time. I love it. I will say our product management team, who are often represented at this meeting by Jason Bulgin, who leads our product management effort here at Smile. We've got the Smile CDR product manager, Jenny Ray, who's joining us in just a moment. She's going to help us out with our Q&A rather, for this webinar. But I will say that team have just moved to this awesome new tool for product, basically for product management. It has the hilariously simple name of Product Board, which really doesn't do it justice. It's an incredibly cool tool, actually. We're just getting used to what it can do. But the reason I mention that here is we are really trying to transition from mostly short-term plans into, continuing to plan short-term, but also doing more and more medium and long-term planning in terms of what we're going to build into both of our products, and having a dedicated tool like the awesome one we've selected for that will be a big part of that. I say all of this and I'm springing this on them a little bit. I am hoping in the future we'll start showing off some of the awesome visualizations and get into that tool at this webinar. So Jenny, watch out for that. I guess we'll hound you for that in a future release. So that is all I've got to say about the release today, other than there's a staggering number of changes in the change logs. So I didn't get to nearly everything. There's so much more that went in that I just couldn't fit into this webinar. Go and check out the change logs, and I am now happy to turn it over to Q&A. So everyone, meet Jenny.
Thank you, James. Yeah, that was really great. The first webinar back in May was on my second day here. So I'm excited to be a part of this one and to see all the hard work and passion that you mentioned go into it. So we have one question here coming in from Bob around ingestion. So is there a capability to ingest X12 data into Smile CDR directly, or do we need to convert to FHIR format before hitting the Smile CDR API?
Awesome. So we have had a few requests for X12 over actually, truthfully, the years. I feel like somebody was asking for it the day we released the first version of Smile. But with that said, it is not something that we've got native support for today. Our approach always for these types of things has been, if somebody wants a new format, we will sort of get into it with them, figure out, do they really need it? And ultimately, if they do, of course, we're happy to build it. But we sort of try and do a bit of detailed analysis before getting into it too much. We've started that process a couple of times, and it's always sort of turned out that it really wasn't the core thing that was needed by whoever was asking. So we've never gone through with building it. Doing that translation, we certainly do know of customers who have done that type of translation using third-party engines. And of course, that's absolutely possible. We've got a fairly decent partnership with a few of those vendors, and we know that this can absolutely be done with products like Iguana and Lineate and that type of thing. So I guess the short answer to that is we don't have that native support. You do need to sort of use a third-party tool today. it's not a terribly hard thing to do with many of those tools. And of course, if anyone did need that capability added, really wanted to wanted to get into it with us, we of course are always happy to talk about that. It doesn't just apply to X12. We love talking integration and new data formats with people. That's one of my favorite discussions personally.
Great. So do have questions coming in. I have one. So you mentioned there are some interesting use cases and interesting examples of partitioning. I'm wondering if you could explain that a little more, if you were the interesting ones that you had seen.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the partitioning front, I mean, just to start by sort of explaining it to anyone who's not familiar with it, the way partitioning works in both HAPI FHIR and SMILE CDR is that if you've got partitioning turned on, every single record that you enter into your database is assigned a partition ID, and that ID is just plain basically just plain a number, and that number can be of your choosing. We've got an entire interceptor framework that allows you to sort of help figure out what number you want to assign to any given resource. And it's completely up to you what you ultimately do with it. The use case when we initially introduced the system, of course, was multi-tenancy. And that remains of course, one of the key use cases. Multi-tenancy in this context is kind of the classic, think about it the way a system like GitHub works, where if I log into GitHub, I can see all of my own private repositories, but I can't see all of Ken's private repositories because I'm not in Ken's tenant. We've each got our own set, our own playground with all of our own, I guess in GitHub's case, repositories, and in the context of a FHIR server, all of my own resources. And often people will use that for things like organizational partitioning. So if I have got a great big repository and I'm storing data on behalf of 3 organizations, I could use the partitioning to sort of create a multi-tenant aware FHIR server where each organization has their own unique pool of resources. That was use case number 1, but we've seen lots of other ones. The other one, which I guess truthfully we also knew about while we were building partitioning, and it was actually probably the main reason we built it in the first place, was for segmenting data by date so that old partitions could be dropped off. One kind of a fascinating use case that's weird to explain, but I always think it's kind of neat, is if you think about a database that is constantly adding tons of new data from external sources, perhaps, because it's synchronizing with an old system. If you've got some sort of desire to lop off older parts of your data, in other words, I want to keep data around for 2 years, but not any longer than 2 years in my FHIR repository, you can, of course, use things like the expunge operation to delete that old data. But if you're ingesting data really, really quickly, constantly, it actually becomes kind of difficult to expunge it as fast as you're ingesting it. For all kinds of reasons. Sometimes deleting is truthfully slower than writing because of the complexities involved in deleting. So we've seen people use partitioning to sort of effectively create date-based partitions. And then once in a while, a number of the big database platforms allow you to sort of pair our partitioning with the concept of partitioning or sharding or whatever it's called in your database platform of choice to effectively, in one fell swoop, instantly drop off whatever partition you want, like delete the whole thing and just forget about it. So this becomes this really neat way of deleting your data instantly. Another interesting use case we've seen, and this actually comes to a feature that we added that I didn't talk about in the webinar, is we've introduced this concept of patient ID partition mode, which allows your partition ID to be the ID of the patient whose data is being stored. So if I've got a patient with resource ID 123, then that resource goes into partition 123, but then all of the resources related to that patient will also end up in the same partition. So all their observations, all their encounters, all their allergy intolerances and vaccinations and all that stuff will all go into partition 123, which means that if I want to find any data about patient Ken, all of Ken's data lives in a single partition, which if you're trying to build a just massive scale repository is awesome, actually, because it allows you, again, to take advantage of native partitioning in various database platforms and say that, of course, my query, whatever I'm looking for, whether it's a complete record or a set of vaccinations or anything else, I can just go to that one partition in the underlying database and just look there for data, which, of course, if you're trying to scale, is just an incredible thing because modern modern database platforms, they can do some really neat stuff with their own partitioning tables or partitioning capabilities in terms of affecting speed. I mean, those three are probably the best examples I can talk about, and that's probably enough to say about all of that. There are a bunch more, but I think those are the three most fascinating ones I've seen in the last while.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a question coming from YouTube here around HAPI-FHIR libraries. So is there any HAPI, or are there any HAPI-FHIR libraries we could use to convert from FHIR bundles to open EHR templates?
Oh, interesting. So, I mean, certainly conversion from, well, I guess let's start by saying, I mean, if anyone is unfamiliar, the question is, of course, are there any libraries for converting from FHIR to OpenEHR, which is often called OpenEHR? OpenEHR is just a fascinating standard. It is, I guess it could be termed, and a lot of people would call it a competitor to FHIR. I truthfully, I don't know that I think of it that way. It is another tool in your arsenal if you're trying to build up integration infrastructure or health data infrastructure. Both FHIR and OpenEHR can be useful tools. In terms of conversion, I mean, I will say conversion from FHIR to OpenEHR, certainly outside the scope of HAPI-FHIR, the library. I think it arguably could be inside the scope of Smile CDR, but not something we've ever tried to tackle. I have not personally seen anyone try to tackle that, if I'm honest. I'm not aware of any libraries that exist out there for doing that in any language, actually. Doesn't mean they don't exist, but it's not something I've seen. I think, honestly, my recommendation, if you're looking for that, might be to take that question to chat.phir.org, aka the FHIR Zulip, because it's entirely possible there are people working on that. I wouldn't at all be surprised if there were, but it's not something I've personally seen.
Great. Yeah, we actually had a comment in the chat on Zoom saying how we've seen lots of mails from you in the HAPI-FHIR forum, so it's very much appreciated. And then just back on partitioning, does multi-tenancy support use the partitioning capability?
You want to take that one?
Me?
No, Ken.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, that's how it works. The multi-tenant mechanism just allows you to map a part of the URL, or you can assign a tenant through an interceptor on the HTTP request, and then based on that, it's assigned a partition. They both take advantage of an integer column on all of the tables that store clinical data.
Occurs to me, I didn't actually introduce Ken either, so I think lots of people already know him, but Ken is our product director for both HAPI-FHIR and Smile CDR, so there you go.
Actually, I just wanted to jump in on the reindex batch operation. One request we've had a lot is to be able to just reindex by a particular type, and this new reindex operation allows you to even do more than that. You can provide it a list of URLs. And you could just say all patients, or you could say only reindex active patients, patients active equals true or whatever. So you basically give it a list of URLs, and then the batch job works its way through those URLs to reindex just those specified resources.
There we go. I didn't even realize it could do that. That's super cool.
Yeah, it's been a frequent request to be able to just reindex certain types. Because often you just add a search parameter on that type. You don't want to reindex everything. So.
Awesome. We're all learning things today. So next question is around comparison between Smile CDR and HAPI-FHIR. So what makes Smile CDR better in terms of performance compared to HAPI-FHIR?
Well, that's a tough question to answer. I guess I'll say, I mean, to start off with, Smile does use the HAPI-FHIR JPA server as is. It's not like we're maintaining sort of a tweaked version of it for Smile or anything like that. And certainly as far as your core FHIR engine, you are running the exact same code, whether you're using the open source HAPI FHIR or Smile or the commercial Smile CDR product. So truthfully, as far as performance goes between those two systems, your plain FHIR read-write performance, they are equivalent. Like I would not expect there to be any difference. If anything, truthfully, the one thing that Smile adds that is performance related for just plain old making FHIR queries in and out of the system, Smile adds the optional capability for you to add auditing, automatic auditing, and automatic transaction logging, which is of course not completely free. It takes up a tiny bit of CPU cycles itself. So from that perspective, Smile is actually slightly slower. It's not a reason not to use it, of course, but that is a true statement, I could say. What Smile brings to the equation, though, which is absolutely worth talking about, is things, various tools that sort of wrap around that core FHIR server, which can be really useful in a performance context. So, for example, let's say that one of your challenges is you want to ingest just a ton of data into your system. Naturally, you can do that through plain old FHIR queries into your system. That's one way of getting data in. But Smile, for example, has added this module called channel import, which allows you to send payloads into Apache Kafka, whether they're FHIR payloads or arbitrary payloads with some other kind of data, and then have, if you need it, our mapping APIs to convert that data to FHIR. Skip that if your data is already FHIR, and then ingest it, taking advantage of Kafka's incredible ability to scale really, really wide. So we've got really big really big volumes of data. And I mean, I've seen certainly people with like literally billions of resources they're trying to get into repositories. If you're trying to do that kind of thing, then absolutely using something like channel import can be super useful in terms of getting data in. Ken, I feel like you wanted to say something there.
No, I was just muting.
Oh, fair enough. There's one simple example. I mean, we've got equivalent tools for getting data back out at rapid scale. So there's all kinds of sort of things that are done there as a part of Smile, which will help you sort of get your data in and out more quickly. The other thing Smile does bring to the table that's worth mentioning is a set of management and monitoring capabilities. Obviously, if you're trying to achieve optimal performance, having the ability to see insights into what your system is doing, where it's spending its time, what bottlenecks you might have, what configuration might be improved, that type of thing can be incredibly useful. And then I guess finally, I should always give a shout out to our client services team, who spend tons of their time actually working with people trying to get their systems operating as fast as they can. And I think there is sometimes there's just no substitute for a helping hand who's had to solve whatever problem you're trying to solve before. So definitely we can't undersell the value of that in terms of better performance. So there's a couple of differences for what it's worth.
So I had just a little bit of conversation going on still around OpenEAR and in FHIR questionnaire response. So just a little bit of background for those who can't see that. So the use case around it was that Vikram wanted to persist data in OpenEAR, but use FHIR for interoperability. And yeah, he said that this isn't common. There may be some code exists that goes from OpenEAR to FHIR questionnaire responses, but not the other way around. That might be Java based. So.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It feels like a good architecture to me too. I mean, we know there are lots of institutions. Certainly, I mean, Europe is a hotspot for that, but not the only hotspot around the world where large organizations have adopted OpenEAR as their core clinical model. And I'm sure those organizations are of course happy with their choice. OpenEAR is a great technology, but probably looking longingly at some of the upcoming app ecosystem stuff that's coming out of FHIR and the great community of applications and capabilities that come with it. So certainly, I think if I were a big hospital with an OpenEAR investment, for example, I'd probably be looking for exactly that, some ability to keep that data in my OpenEAR system, but also get it into a FHIR repository so I can take advantage of all the benefits of having FHIR.
Next up, we have some love for our transaction and audit logs. So we appreciate the transaction and audit logs available within the Smile CDR web admin. Have you considered adding tools to report on this data in aggregate? For instance, to show a count of successful X operations that have happened within a given time interval, perhaps even a configurable dashboard for these stats.
Ooh. Ken, do you have any thoughts? I'm happy to take it if not.
Yeah, sure. This has been it's been a project that's sort of been on the back burner. There's always been something just a little bit more important than it. So it's kind of frustrating to hear because we really want to get to it. I think the approach that we're leaning towards for that is to rely on a tool like Prometheus, great open source metrics reporting tool, and when we already have quite a bit required to do that already built into the product. So I'll just say that's the direction we're going with that. We've got the hooks. We use Drop Wizard internally that Prometheus can connect to and produce those reports. And really what the work that's remaining is just to productize that so that out of the box, you get lots of useful reports that you need.
Anyone has not heard of Prometheus before, go check it out. It is just an incredible management monitoring and reporting tool. That's so nice. It's open source as well, which is why I'm always happy to promote it.
So next on the reindex operation. So you have mentioned that the operation mark all resources for reindexing, great name, will be deprecated. Now, how can we use the reindex operation to index the concepts under code system themselves, not resources URLs?
Interesting. I mean, I guess those code systems would still be pertaining to particular search parameters. Interesting. I don't think I've thought about it that way.
So I bet I can answer this if it's useful. So assuming you're talking about code systems that are complete or fragment code systems, meaning you've got a code system resource and all of its codes actually live inside the actual code system resource. If that's the case you're talking about, then reindexing a code system reindexing, basically invoking a reindex where you're saying, I want to reindex all of my code system resources should accomplish exactly that. Presumably the reason you'd want to do this is to repopulate an Elasticsearch instance or a Lucene instance. That is a real use case people often have, and it's a totally reasonable thing to want to do. And doing a reindex of your code systems should accomplish exactly that. It is worth mentioning if you're talking about external code systems, these are things where you've loaded the content not through the code system resource, but either, for example, you've loaded Loink using our native Loink importer or SNOMED CT, or you're using the terminology Delta operations or any of the operations that allow you to upload terminology, so codes and systems and mappings and that type of thing, without where the codes live outside of the code system resource. If that's the case, then the reindex operation will not touch those code systems. It's not going to get rid of them either, but it's not going to do anything with them either. In that case, if you want to reindex them, really what you have to do is just re-upload them using whatever mechanism you'd uploaded them in the first place.
Next one, have interesting question around MDM. So you mentioned MDM as a foundational technology and how we're seeing real world adoption and how we're just scratching the surface of how useful it can be. So what are some long-term trends that you can foresee with MDM in the real world?
I love it. Ken, you want to take this one? You want me to?
I think we both speak to it. I think, initially what MDM aspires to be is a fully functional EMPI for matching patients that can really stand toe-to-toe with any other commercial enterprise level EMPI out there. And it's worth mentioning that it's a fully HAPI FHIR implementation as well. So that's not a commercial thing. It's in the open source product. So that was our goal there, was to really have for the first time in a long time a strong open source EMPI product. Longer term, one thing that's interesting, we haven't really dug into it yet, but what we envision, because we built it resource independent, so it doesn't, you can match on immunizations, or you could match on lab results or whatever. The thinking is that longer term, it could be used for other things like med reconciliation or immunization reconciliation, that sort of a thing. So very exciting futures. We haven't, so far it's only been really used for the EMPI scenario, but that's what we're thinking about is for reconciling data from multiple systems where you want to build, you know, the best medical record, that sort of thing. Anything to add to that, James?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, you know, just to build on your very final point there, just because I just think it's such a cool use case. I mean, everything that's in there at this point can be applied. Like the rule that's in the MDM module is, as long as the resource has an identifier field, it's a candidate for matching. So, I mean, if you think about that, I mean, like such a common problem in the real world is allergy lists, as a simple example. Like I've got allergies that came from my family doc EMR. I've got them from the last time I was in the hospital. You know, I've probably got them that I told somebody and they somehow ended up in someone else's chart. As long as they've been filed against me, the patient, in any of those systems, if we've got a CDR that's recording all that stuff, then you know, I mean, the world is your oyster there. That we can instantly generate sort of a best known allergy. And much like with you know, a patient EMPI, where you generate a golden resource, we can now generate a golden allergy list as a similar example. And this is all absolutely top order sort of concern at the MDM module. I just think that's such a cool thing. The other thing worth mentioning is sort of the other side of the equation, which is sort of how do we form links? One of the things that's totally unique, or I mean, you know, fairly unique about our implementation, is that it sits as a top order concern within a broader clinical data repository. So while you could, of course, create an EMPI, you know, matching patients by just populating that with patient resources and letting the system do its linking. This, and I will say this is aspirational. This isn't something we're working on yet, but it's something we absolutely plan on working on. Just picture the power of creating links where you're taking advantage of the full set of clinical data. You know, perhaps they're running AI and ML algorithms and training models and things like that. If those models have access not only to the demographics associated with the patient, but to their complete record, it just feels to me like you've got such a better chance of building an accurate set of links. So I mean, this is something we want to explore more. I'm certainly, as I say, being very aspirational with this specific answer, as opposed to talking about tomorrow's plans. But I think it is something that it's really likely we're going to end up going there, and I bet there's some cool stuff that can come from it.
Mm-hmm. And the question was on long-term trends, so I think it's all right for us to be aspirational here. And yeah, I think it also plays nicely into the CDA use case, that golden allergy list where you're trying to give the best information forward, put the best information forward.
Absolutely. Similar to that, I guess if I can say one more thing, the other spot where I think that all makes sense is for things like the international patient summary. If anyone has not seen IPS before, go check it out. IPS is probably, it's underappreciated in the value and the impact I think it's eventually going to have. The IPS, of course, is intended to be a portable little snapshot of everything that a clinician would need to know about James, that I could take over international borders, hence the IPS. But frankly, I think extends in terms of its use cases way beyond someone crossing borders. And the idea that that snapshot could be generated by the best known everything generated by an EMPI, oh, I get shivers thinking how cool that is.
Yeah, I recently just went to an HL7 event on CDA and how the IPS, the International Patient Summary, can be integrated with that. So exciting to see what comes out of that. So I think we are just about on time, and yeah, I don't see any more questions coming through. So
great timing.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. Well, this has been just awesome questions. Thank you, everyone, for well, thanks for joining us first off, as you always do, and thank you for all the awesome questions. We have been recording, and this recording will be shared probably in an hour or two once we've trimmed off all of the pauses at the start and the end. Thank you so much to Jenny for joining us and Ken for joining us, and I guess that's all we'll say. We'll see you in 3 months for the next release. Bye, everyone.